Hello, my name is Tim Lawrence. I'm the Edexcel Psychology Subject Advisor, and this video is to share the first part of the live exam feedback presentation that we delivered at the beginning of October for paper 2 from summer 2023. There'll be a second shorter video, in fact, a choice of 3, because we, at the end of this training, went through the option sections of paper 2 and just looked at the 16 marker from each of those. So you can go to a separate video for that. There are separate videos for the paper 1 feedback training, 2 of those, and there'll be separate videos available in the same playlist for paper 3. You'll be able to download the exemplars that we're going to look at in a minute from the video description. So you can pause this video if you want to read those either on screen or via the download, and consider what marks you would award before we go through that feedback. If I move on to look at our agenda though, so we'll look at a short overview of what went well and the even better ifs from the principal examiner for this paper. We'll look at some exemplars which are different to the ones that you can find in the examiner report. And we'll look in this video at a high scoring 8-mark question from the clinical psychology section, and a high scoring response to the 20 marker as well. And as I said, you can find the feedback on the 16 marker from the option topic that you have taught in a separate video. So overview of how the paper as a whole went, and these are strengths. And just to give you a bit more feedback on those, most candidates could state reasons for using a chi-squared test and were able to correctly identify whether the results were significant or not and explain why. More candidates attempted to calculate the Wilcoxon-Signed ranks test than have done in previous years when they've had to do that calculation, with more being able to calculate it accurately by using the instructions at the front of the paper. So that's a strength, something that centres are doing well, and something to think about if you could do even better with your students, making them really familiar with how to use those pages and statistics at the start of the paper. Going on to explanations and therapies, candidates were able to show they knew different theories in described questions. There were some good answers on the neurotransmitter explanation of schizophrenia, the use of interviews in clinical psychology, and the use of a psychological treatment for schizophrenia, as well as the treatment in the options paper. So point 3 here, AO2 in essays, candidates are getting better at applying the detail from scenarios in essays, with more of them in their responses showing application of relevant evidence from the context and using details from the context rather than simply mentioning the name of the person in the scenario, which, as we've said in previous training, is not enough to get AO2 content. They need to pick out details, and highlighting short sections of the scenario and quoting short sections of the scenario are good exam technique skills to work on. Final point here, more candidates are now able to identify improvements when asked to do so in relation to a scenario. So those were all things that were good about this paper. And the examiner feedback on what students and centres can be working on, explaining strengths and weaknesses. So while most candidates can identify a strength, only the best, or weakness, only the best go on to explain them. So, for example, they need to ensure that they explain how or why the strength of a study improves the reliability, the credibility, or whatever is being asked for in a specific question. A lot of candidates just write the term and don't go into that further explanation. Point 2 here. So candidates often fail to add details from the scenario to their answers for short answer questions. So in general, they're better at this skill in the extended response questions. For those shorter questions that assess AO2, they often don't put that bit of detail in that they need. They need to add more than the name. It might be helpful if they underlined or highlighted key points, as I just said, from the scenario to remind them to include these details. Point 3 here, justifying an improvement. Many candidates can identify an improvement, but this is often linked to a weakness of the study. Candidates need to focus their AO3 point on how their identified improvement will make the study better, not what was originally an issue with the study. So this is where you have like a couplet of marks available. for example, AO2 and then AO3, and the AO3 one is the justification explaining why it would make a difference. And then finally, balance in essays and the longer questions. So this is balance being used to refer to the balance between AO1 and AO3, for example. So they need to know that for an 8-mark question, there's always going to be looking for equal. So a balance of equal AO1 and AO3 approximately, whereas for the 16 and 20 markers, for to get into the higher mark bands, they need to be putting more time and depth into the AO3 because they're weighted 6 and 10 marks for 16 and 8 and 12 marks for 20 markers towards the AO3. Okay, so moving on then to look at a couple of extended response questions. So we've got this first one here, an 8-marker, discuss how Lydia could use interviews with the patients in the mental health unit. You must make reference to the context in your answer. So we looked at a couple of discuss questions in Unit 1. They remain, I think, a challenging type of question. So we'll have a look at this one here. And you can pause the video if you'd like to read this response on screen. But remember, you can download it in the description as well. And I'll just show you the second page. And then I'll give you feedback on this on the next slide. So pause if you don't want to see that now. So this was a very strong response, awarded 8 marks out of 8. And I can give you a little bit more feedback on why that mark was given. So the AO1, page 1 shows knowledge and understanding of unstructured, structured interviews and semi-structured. At the end of page 1 and going on to page 2, there is knowledge and understanding of closed questions, as well as how these can be used to report back to the manager. Further down page 2, there's knowledge and understanding of open questions and collection of qualitative data. The AO1 is merged with the AO2, and some of the knowledge and understanding comes within the AO2, especially for closed and open questions. So an interesting one, this, because it's really important, and this was key feedback for paper 1 as well, that candidates recognise that they're being assessed not just for their discussion of the scenario here, which is the 4 marks of AO2, but they need to show in-depth knowledge of the sort of psychological content that's being assessed. So in this question, the use of their research method. So whilst this comment from the examiner makes it clear that AO1 credit can be kind of given within their AO2 application, they're not going to be given much AO1 credit unless there's clear kind of depth of knowledge evident there in addition to the application. So it's a bit of a balancing act because time is obviously tight, but they're probably best advised to treat these as separate skills within their answer and make sure that they give clear, detailed knowledge separate from the context and then apply it. For the AO2, it's sustained throughout this response with some application with every AO1 point. The answer goes beyond just repeating Lydia's name. So, for example, on page 1, they write about the mental health units, the reports she has to write. On page 2, there's examples of closed and open questions that she can use, which are relevant to the scenario. So that was really good. Towards the end of page 2, there is further AO2 about how she could analyze the data to suggest improvements to the manager. So really thinking about the scenario and how the knowledge of the psychology can be applied to make sense of it. In the time available to write this essay, we could not ask for any more. So both AO1 and AO2 are at level 4, and that's 8 out of 8. Okay, so moving on then, and we'll look at this 20-mark response. The question, to what extent could one psychological treatment be effective for Henry's schizophrenia? You must make reference to the context in your answer. So again, you can download this, might be easier to read, but if you'd like to read it on screen, you can pause. There's page 2, page 3, page 4, And there's page 5. And on the next page, we have the marker awarded, which was 19 out of 20 for this response. So to give you a bit more justification of the mark, there is knowledge and understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy here. Page 1, they write about how it combines cognitive and learning approaches in the therapy, and then they go on to write about stage 1, building a rapport, why this is important in therapy, how the therapist destigmatizes and educates. That was all good A1 content. Page 2, they write about stage 2 and identifying the triggers and how to create new healthy routines. They then go on to write about the behavioral aspect and how positive reinforcement is used and how the hallucinations may be challenged. So really well linked to the context. They also write about coping mechanisms. At the bottom of page 2 and onto page 3, we've got how the progress is reviewed. The answer demonstrates accurate and comprehensive knowledge and understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy. A2, there's application throughout the essay, with details from the scenario being integrated and synthesized throughout the AO1. On pages 1 to 3, it clearly links to details from the scenario using a variety of details, and they help expand on the AO1. There's also integration throughout the AO3 points from page 3 to 5. So really good answers will carry these links through from the scenario, not only to the AO1 content, but also to the AO3 evaluation, with explanations here about how the AO3 point may mean the treatment is or is not effective for Henry. AO3, we have on page 3 a strength about how he can learn to cope, which is developed through the use of the Bradshaw study and has a mini judgment about showing how it is effective and how it might work for Henry. So another thing we've talked about a fair bit is conclusions and mini conclusions, judgments and mini judgments for this type of question. And there's a good example there. There's no need for a separate judgment or conclusion paragraph as long as there are mini judgments, mini conclusions all the way through. Page 4, there's a weakness about how Henry's schizophrenia is due to neurotransmitters potentially. Again, this is well developed. There's a mini judgment there as well about how this means cognitive behavioral therapy may not be effective for Henry. And at that point, I'll just make a quick mention of a mistake that I know quite a lot of students made here, because teachers contacted us about it, not recognizing that this question was about non-biological therapies when it says psychological therapies. So that's one to highlight. The specification is wording is perhaps could be clearer here, and that's feedback we've passed on to the examiners, because sometimes it talks about biological and non-biological. Sometimes, as in this question, it's about psychological, meaning not biological. So if students just wrote about drug therapy, then they would have not scored well, although it can be used as a kind of contrasting argument, contrasting explanation and contrasting therapy here. Finally, to complete this feedback on this response, page 5 has an alternative therapy with a mini judgment about how this means drugs may be better for Henry. There's also a final judgment about how a combination of drugs and cognitive behavioral therapy may be best for Henry, and an explanation about why. So just really good AO3 skills on evidence there. So as the AO3 is well developed, it was decided to put this into level 5. There's a slight imbalance in terms of the distribution of content between the AOs, and the fact that there are only 3 points, so not quite the full marks, but 19 out of 20. And that brings us to the end of the clinical psychology topic. So you can watch a separate video if you'd like to on the option topic of your choice, which you can find in the same playlists. Thanks very much for watching to the end of this bit. Those are my contact details, and yeah, hopefully you'll hear me again on the option topic in a minute.